Listening to vulnerable children in interactive research encounters was about following children towards important places. It was about considering them as guides and listening to their stories. About assisting them in their classrooms and connecting in their web. Listening to children was about moving with them, thinking with them, and becoming with them. Diving into interactive encounters of emergent listening with children is not without risk or difficulty. It requires time, it requires energy and vulnerability. It asks us to let go of structures, plans, and frameworks we find precarious and desire. And it offers discomfort instead, and surprises. Doing research with children is not about doing research disorderly or without discipline. It is not about discovering something that is already there. It is about opening up to the unexpected. About becoming part of a relational event, a movement in which we recognize the other in multiplicity and difference. And it creates new ways of doing, new ways of knowing, new ways of living. For me, it started with the question of voice. With the help of post-qualitative frameworks and childhood literature, we reconceptualize children's voices as present in many forms. As dynamically flowing rather than separate, authentic and stable. As pluralized, polyvocal and messy rather than attached to a coherent individual. As mediated through material and discursive practices. As affecting and affected by each other, by interactions and positions, as a messiness. As a living movement that allows new ways of thinking to emerge. As a disruptive process that explores the world, explores theories and knowledges we build and reproduce. As a voice, as Mazet describes it, that escapes our easy classification and that does not make easy sense. The voice in the crack. This is a conceptualization of voice we have tried to work with in interactive encounters with children. So we have worked with this reconceptualization of voice in 4 different interactive encounters with children. The first encounter was with a group of children aged 9 to 10 in primary education. We followed them towards places that were important to them and thought about relational complexities in their lives and how these are related to difference. The second encounter was with a group of youngsters with a disability within the scope of a large European study. We look back at the research process in order to learn ethically and methodologically from children as participants. The third interactive encounter was with Alex and his team in an inclusive trajectory in primary education, where we thought about inclusion as emerging in collaborative movements in team. And the fourth interactive encounter was with the teachers of Marta and Luisa, 2 girls whose parents were at the end of an immigration procedure and thus expelled out of the country. We worked with the metaphor of their empty desk in relation to belonging in socially just pedagogies. Looking back at these interactive encounters with children, we centralize 5 concepts that help us to concretize listening to children's voices in interactive encounters. 5 concepts that have the potential to transform an encounter with children into an interactive one of genuinely listening. So the first concept I would like to discuss with you is investing in small stories and minor gestures. During our interactive research encounters, children come up with lots of small stories. Haraway states people tell stories to tell other stories with. Their stories make worlds, their worlds make stories. This means small stories are powerful and matter since they point to structural and systemic knots, repetitive and destructive patterns. Small stories help us to stay with the trouble, the complexity that has to be changed, although we believe it already outgrew us. Small stories have the potential to function as minor gestures in pedagogical research spaces. Small stories as minor gestures make normative practices clear and offer alternatives, help us think about a more than. The minor gesture troubles everyday structures and discourses and gives space to uncertainty. It opens experience to its potential variations. It shows doing pedagogics and research differently is not about the grand pedagogical shifts, but about creating dissonance on a pattern of normativity. When it comes to research practices, the minor gesture troubles dominant technical and procedural frameworks, methods and valuing systems institutions hold on to. It opens up the field of relation, collectiveness, and co-compositions. In a collective paper, a small story about learning how to ride a bike learned us a lot about normative expectations impacting all of us and our desire to become able. This awareness is a first step in attuning to what else is possible. As a second concept, I would like to talk with you about getting in touch with your responsibility. Bharat describes the potential to take our responsibility and create new possibilities for justice as inherent to every single interaction. This means we are never not responsible or responsible. Taking responsibility for our entanglement in the world's becoming is being accountable for what matters and what is excluded from mattering. It is about stopping to ignore the exclusionary effects our entanglements have and investigate and dismantle those assemblages that violate people. If we as a researcher are part of that which we seek to study, then we are never distant or not aligned with others. It calls us to account for what comes to matter in our practices and research encounters. Research then becomes a relational practice. It becomes collective knowing and doing. Ethics becomes an immanent responsibility more than a question of control and repetition. It requires a sensitive role of listening, and it extends to the non-material becomings altering what comes to matter. When working with the empty desk in the class of Marta and Louisa, we slowly pixelized the images to show how possible entrances into the situations there are. Many opportunities become able to offer a response. A third concept I would like to discuss with you is presuming movement near borders. In our interactive encounters with children, we have reflected on borders along relational complexities in children's lives, and on borders excluding vulnerable children from contemporary debates on important aspects of their lives and in research. We reconceptualize borders as spaces of becoming rather than something static, of transformation, of connections, of difference. They become spaces of questions and possibilities, of friction and opening, of creativity and new forms of knowing. Thinking about borders in this way as a movement can counter dominant binaries and normativity. And in this we have built on Kutley and Rund's recall to demonstrate how difference can disrupt, can question and disorientate normativity while it desires it. Border thinking also shifts the focus away from the normative center towards what happens near the margins. Children connect and disconnect, negotiate and are negotiated upon in their relations towards each other. This means inclusion is not a yes or no condition, rather continuously moving and emerging in our interactions with each other. Doing research with children in creative ways was about letting go also of straight plans and the temptation to control in order to be open to being surprised. These data, participants, methods, theory, they are never separable and only definable because of what they can do in a particular assemblage on a particular moment. The fourth concept I would like to share something about is fostering belonging and becoming wit. Haraway says we require each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations, in hot compost piles. We become with each other or not at all. Post-qualitative philosophy reimagines human life in terms of belonging. We cannot be understood without the context we hope to belong in. Davies says, by being affected by the other, we accomplish our humanity. This is how the communities of which we are part create and recreate themselves. In order to attend to this radical relationality in children's lives, listening to children in research as well as in pedagogical spaces has to become listening to children in their web. The concept of becoming wit has important consequences for qualitative research with children. Firstly, the individual is never present in research. It's always about movement, making wit, composing wit, becoming wit. So this makes clear relational ethics is about more than incorporating the relation between researcher and participant. It is also about recognizing and being aware of the many different relations affecting what comes to matter at a certain moment. Secondly, defining the encounter between researcher and participant in terms of becoming wit also holds potential to imagining things differently and to jointly expand capabilities. Researcher and participant compose and decompose each other in their ethical entanglements and render each other capable in collective knowing and doing, as Haraway says. So previous concepts have been building on two refrains. The first refrain is a movement away from normativity. The second refrain is a movement towards relationality. Both refrains bring us to a focus on interdependency in more than human relationships. We become vulnerable and relational beings who give and receive care in our entanglements. Kite asks us to break open the normative body, to think about varying answers on the question of what makes a life a flourishing one. This question becomes especially reliable in education, where little attention is given to the intrinsic worth of care or caring attitudes. Children with special education needs, their flourishing might be more precarious and inhibited by normative standards, on which basis educators take an early exit instead of staying with the trouble. When we bring in Kite's notion of connection-based equality, which recognizes functioning in interdependence and in caring relationships, to education, this might open space and time to build relationships. In this way, care becomes an action of justice, as well as a commitment to equality. Toronto's care ethics includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and prepare the world so that we may live in it as well as possible. In Toronto's conceptualization, care becomes a democratic practice. It has important social and political implications for people experiencing exclusion. It becomes a component of inclusive citizenship. Ethics of care also has implications for doing post-qualitative research, where it becomes important to consider many entangled ways children consent and participate in research. Eva Kite's thinking strengthens the entanglement of and creative tension between human agency and human vulnerability. It avoids the spreading position between a focus on protection or a focus on participation in research with children. And at the end of discussing 5 ideas, 5 concepts that emerge out of our interactive encounters with children, I would like to use this quote of Alice. So during this presentation, we have centralized 5 concepts. Each brought central questions to the front when it comes to listening to children in vulnerable situations through interactive research encounters. Rather than giving straightforward answers, I hope this presentation might help us to pose the right questions, which keeps practices, positions, and voices in movement and makes a continuous demand to stay with the trouble. How can our research and our pedagogical practices be generative of minor gestures and avoid those forms of control that capture it? Which response are we able to offer? How can we avoid binary or border thinking in favor of movement and connection? How can this encounter become more than one about growing up and educating, one about becoming with and belonging? How can we shift focus towards an ethics of care and connection-based equality? I genuinely believe these questions hold the potential to change our way of interacting with children in pedagogy and in research. A first step to take is to feel addressed to stay with the trouble, to become aware of our presence in challenging events rather than seeking ways to exit it. The second step is to make trouble. So we need to be less humble about the role we, in our entanglements, play in the world's becoming. We are entangled and can make a difference. In other ways, we need to become more humble and less sure in order to remain open, to leave the center, and to seek up the margins.